Do we have any apologies for absence?
We don't have any apologies for absence today, Chair.
Good. And any declarations of interest? Councillor Rickson.
Thank you, Chair. Item 3, non-financial, by virtue of the fact of being the Highland Council nominee to the Low Carbon Environmental Group, but it doesn't preclude me from taking part in the debate. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And Councillor Fraser.
It's only a quick question. I think this would be it's not a declaration of interest as such, but I really struggle without the paper copies of the meeting, and I would like to see a paper copy of this sent to me, because I would find it a lot easier to follow rather than going backwards and forwards through a PDF.
Well, we have to think about the climate impacts on that, Councillor Fraser, and I think it's been a general thing. You would need to speak to Councillor Lobbin, I think, was the instigator behind that, to see what can be done. Other than that, then perhaps if you want to print it yourself, it's not a huge amount. Have you got 2 screens?
I struggle with one screen.
Yeah, I just find the second screen does make a big difference to watching it, but we can talk about that offline and see if there's anything we can do about that.
That's fine. Happy to do that.
Okay. No other declarations of. Oh yes, Councillor Davidson's got her hand up. Councillor Davidson.
Thank you, Trish. Can you declare an interest ahead? I don't know. But I'll just say it anyway. We will be applying to some of the schemes that are in our report on insulation and home improvement. And if you lived in my house, you'd understand why. So I just thought I'd declare that now, even though we haven't yet. Do you follow me?
Okay, you may have to do it again in the future.
Oh.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. Okay, members, it won't have escaped your notice that the IPCC report came out just a little while ago, which has reinforced how stark the challenge ahead is in terms of tackling climate change. It's been published at a time when the floods, wildfires and extreme heat are rife across the world. We're seeing them daily on our news reports. The problem's getting rapidly worse, and the bad news from the report is we're getting perilously close to 1.5 degrees of warming, which, as you all know, will be aware is the target set under the Paris Agreement back in 2016. The good news, though, is that the report sets out that if we can get into net zero emissions, additional warming will stop. The Council has both a legal and moral obligation to do whatever we can to achieve net zero emissions, and the path is relatively clear. We know what we have to do to make this a reality. We must stop using fossil fuels to heat our buildings and to power our fleet. We must invest in our buildings to ensure they are efficient and using as little energy as possible. And we must ensure that climate commitments are a critical component of our capital programme and procurement decisions. Over and above that, we have a duty to make a strong leadership role around the agenda to support our communities. And as elected members, it's vital that we are all empowered to ensure the decisions we're taking in the Chamber are supportive of our climate aspirations. And I would add, we have a wee bit of a duty to educate others as well. So I would encourage all of you who haven't already done so to undertake the carbon literacy training currently being offered by the Scottish Cities Alliance, and I know some have already. I will ensure that details are circulated later so that others can take this up. And of course, we have to continue to plant trees, restore our peatlands and clean up our seas. So we've got a long way to go, but you will see from the reports today that there's a lot ongoing and a lot to get started. So on that, I think we can move directly to the Energy Efficient Scotland update at item 3, and I think Stuart Miller's going to give us a wee bit of a thing on that. Stuart, can we ask you to take over, please?
Thank you very much, Chair. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Great, thank you.
Yes, we can.
The programme is designed to target fuel households across the Highlands to offer energy efficiency measures to improve comfort levels, reduce heating costs. It's expected the majority of households qualifying for the programme will also have been directly impacted by COVID-19. The programme allows additional support to be offered to eligible Highland residents while safeguarding the household and community during the COVID-19 pandemic and continuing our commitment to the Scottish Government. The programme on average has annual carbon savings of 20,897 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, making a significant contribution to the Council's ambition to deliver a carbon neutral region by 2025. A critical risk to the programme is achieving scheme sign-ups. To mitigate this risk, we are embarking on a marketing exercise. Support from elected members is key to delivery of the programme through both council and councillor endorsement. If grant funding cannot be fully spent, it may hinder future funding awards to the council. The council has been awarded Scottish Government funding to deliver the East Abs programme for the 9th consecutive year, leveraging circa of 32.8 million of external funding to the Highlands over that time. We deliver energy efficiency measures, including external wall insulation, cavity and loft insulation, solar PV and air source heat pumps to approximately 3,000 privately owned and privately rented properties. The sources of the funding can be summarised as follows: Scottish Government grant of about 3.2 million per year, the ECO from the companies and the Warm Homes Fund. We've submitted a successful bid for rural homes and communities to provide a provision to install 300 air source heat pumps. This funding stream ends in March 2022. The Scottish Government also covers Highland Council staff costs at the relevant property section charge-out rates. Although the measures have decreased from 2021 to 2022, we've gone from the estimated spend has increased for year 9. As I said before, the total grants funding from the Scottish Government is expected to be £3.2 million. COVID has had a significant impact on the delivery of the programme, and the revised deadline for spend has been extended to September 2021. The targets for both cavity wall and loft insulation are progressing well towards the September target. However, the installations for external wall insulation and first-time central heating are unlikely to achieve the September deadline. The introduction of new legislation, PAS 2035-2019, which is a new energy efficiency retrofit standard for eco-funded measures, has increased the timelines significantly from survey to installation across all measures. As a result, the installation of external wall insulation has ceased while identification of resources and practices are reviewed. There are shortages of qualified individuals and companies able to carry out this retrofit assessment, again negatively impacted upon the timelines. We are working with the energy efficiency contractor and the Scottish Government to agree options. First-time central heating works were only able to resume in mid-March due to the restrictions of access. The work ceased again at the beginning of July for 2 weeks due to the introduction of this new legislation, but have now resumed. The revised programme for completion shows that we will finish the air source heat pumps for year 2 in November of 21. And once we finish that point, we can then start on year 3 installations. The main challenges in respect of the delivery of the programme being summarised as follows. The funding available per household is standardised funding levels are set by the Scottish Government, which poses a challenge for Highland delivery as installation costs are considerably higher, and that leads to a paucity of contractors that are able to do the works as well. Progress has been compromised by the impact of COVID and the introduction of this new legislation. And there is a paucity of knowledge, both locally and nationally, in Scotland around the requirements and impacts of PAS 2035. Most of it has been centred around UK building standards, and some of the Scottish building standards are different. And so there's knowledge gaps in being able to obtain training on that. Our next steps are increasing the marketing. We're sending out targeted marketing today to increase interest in sign-ups. We're also trying to finalise area selection for 2022 and 23 applications, and we're continuing to try and source and work with local contractors. We're also looking at other energy efficiency measures, and we're trying to align the ABS programme with the housing capital. The benefits of the programme are to target fuel poor areas, provide support for those in fuel and extreme fuel poverty, and support households who are vulnerable to the effects of living in a cold home, and provide significant savings to household or fuel bills, while at the same time reduce carbon emissions. The programme has resulted in a number of benefits to householders across the region, including lower fuel bills and increased home comfort levels, and in many instances improvements to the aesthetics of the home, and in some instances reductions in noise levels. I'd like to thank you for listening to my brief report and would welcome any questions.
Thank you for that, Stuart. I have a couple of questions myself. Is there local training programs that are easily accessed for the skills to be upgraded? And is it a fixed amount per household? Because that may very well have be altered because of the lack of materials and the increased prices that seem to be prevalent across the board. Do we know about that?
Yeah. The local training is an interesting one. We have, and the council have, very well trained staff, but the introduction of this new legislation has, I think, caught people on the hop. When we go back and we talk to experts who are management contractors, they don't fully understand the programme, and they have been, researching on it as well. Thankfully, we have a real broad brush of expertise within our team, and so as a team we've looked at it individually, we've looked at it collectively to see where these knowledge gaps are, and we are working to have that training both externally and within house to try and bridge that knowledge gap. So it's a bit of a process because we want to make sure we're getting the right training, and that we're embedding it within the institution. So it's an ongoing progress that we're definitely looking at. In terms of your second question, Chair, it's a fixed amount per household, and I know that previously we have lobbied the Scottish Government to take account of the logistics problems that do exist in the Highlands, and we have gained some ground on that. But I don't think it's fair to be said that we haven't gained a real amount over the whole period of time. And what we're trying to do at the moment, and one of the things we're embarking upon, is to try and gain evidence so that we can present evidence back to the government to say, this is what we are finding. So it is definitely one of the things that are high up on our agenda, to identify the additional costs, to put them in, as I say, in evidence and present that back to the Scottish Government.
Thank you, Stuart. This programme is key for going forward, and I'm sure there'll be others to follow it up. So I'm glad you're on the case for that. Councillor Thompson, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Stuart, for the presentation. I wanted to ask about the impact of the Grenfell inquiry and what's become more evident about the practices of the building industry in terms of marketing plastic-based external wall insulation. I've got a specific example of it within my own ward where private householders benefited from the Swedish timber house external wall insulation. I mean, I say benefited because even at the time that was sold to those owners, it wasn't clear to me what the actual insulation benefit would be, because there was the design had cold air circulating behind the insulation. The insulation was attached to the outside of the existing house with a gap, and cold air was intentionally pushed up behind the insulation. And I think the cost there was about £20,000 per house. So, I mean, there's a kind of general question about how are we approaching, or how's the scheme approaching dealing with the industry after everything that's come out of Grenfell, but also in terms of the Swedish Timber House programme, do we have any evidence that that successfully reduced heating costs for owners? And are we examining whether that design that was put on the Swedish timber houses is a fire risk, circulating cold air in a chimney-like fashion behind a flammable, potentially flammable external insulation? Seems questionable at best, and I'm not aware there's been any investigation into that system that was put on those houses, because it was very new 2-3 years ago. Thanks very much, Chair.
I'll add a couple before I come back to Stuart, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Councillor Loudon, please.
Yeah, I think the first thing there, Trish, it would be to echo what Ben is saying. That if that is the case, if that's what the insulation that was applied to the external walls of these houses consists of, whose liability it is to remove it will be a pretty significant issue. I think Grenfell has taught us a number of things, but one, where houses are rented or leased, very often the terms in the lease pass responsibility for things like this to the tenants, and the owner who's leased the property to them can escape liability. So I think that there are a number of issues in what Ben's raised there that we need to hollow out. What I wanted to refer to is 5.1 on page 3. It's looking at year 9, and I think it's showing 390 homes. I tried to work out roughly how many homes there are in the Highlands, and it may be sort of, I think, some 100 to 120,000. And at that rate, I think it would take 320 years to have these improvements rolled out across the Highlands. So really, I'm grateful for there being one house on the list. Every single home that is improved is a really positive thing, but it strikes me as an extraordinarily small number of homes when you look at what we're trying to achieve in response to the climate emergency, for such a small number of homes to be improved. Now, I understand that some people are wealthy and may not need the support, but just as with Grenfell, the cost of removing that external cladding is tens of thousands of pounds for every individual property. The cost of these renovations can be tens of thousands of pounds for every home.
Yes.
So, we have to, I think, if we're going to make these kind of changes, we have to recognise that there are not really all that many people in the Highlands with that kind of money to spend. So how, as a council, are we going to respond to that? Was really the question I wanted to ask.
Thanks, Councillor Hodgson. And one more, Councillor Fraser, please, and then we'll come back to you, Stuart.
My hand's up too, Trish, please, if you could put me in the queue.
So I just forgot my mic there. I actually had a brief look through the Business Energy Industrial Strategy report that was released June this year, and it makes a very interesting read. There's a great deal of information in there, especially on renewable obligation certificates. I'll recommend people scan through that and then pick up on that one. The RHI, as Stuart, I should have said thank you very much, Stuart, for your clarity of report there. The RHI closes to new applications in March next year. I have been a recipient of this incentive, and it has been very successful. I think it's been very successful over the 7 years that it's been running. The replacement, if you look at what is replacing it, it is a poorer financial package than what was there originally. The other thing is that it's been replaced with a clean heat grant from April next year, which is £100 million. Now, £100 million from the UK government is petty cash. You know, they're not even considering it. They can find 37 billion on various other bits and pieces. Their priorities are in the wrong way, and that filters down through to the devolved governments such as Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. 5.1, which Derek picked up on, we have a number of listed buildings. They need to be brought up to standard. I've raised this with Ben at the Housing and Property Committee, and we're still no further forward in making sure those properties are wind and watertight, and we have tenants in them. And that is a significant cost because the type of building they are, they're solid wall buildings. The other issue on 5.1 is that some of our listed buildings, I can think of a number, you cannot go and put external insulation on a listed building. It's just not going to happen. And if you want to put it on the inside, you're going to reduce you're going to have to strip the building back to its bare essentials and start from scratch. So it's a complete non-starter. So I'd like to know how we deal with that. And this isn't. This is just from reading through this. 5.4 is really a depressing read that it costs £2,500 more per property to bring them up to standard. Yet we have discounts on energy in our cities. Whereas it doesn't matter if it's a rural Highland or rural Cornwall or rural Wales. These people that live in these properties in these areas need to be have the ability to make sure that their properties are wind and watertight and comfortable for the future generations. So I think our Highland rural communities are actually being disadvantaged and discriminated against just because of the location that they happen to live in. So basically, overall, there's not enough funding, and governments need to reassess their priorities, because if they are serious on climate change, they need to actually step up to the plate and fund it properly, not just give a bit here and a bit there, and then try and get people to apply for a grant that they might not even get. And Stuart and his team and Keith's team, they do a tremendous amount behind the scenes that we don't see, and I am extremely grateful for that. And I've made that comment on various occasions, so I'll leave it there. Otherwise, I'll go into a bit of a rant.
Thank you, Craig. That's grand. I have two speakers after this, but I'll come back to Stuart for that bit first. Okay, thank you, Stuart.
Yeah, there's a number of really good points there. Maybe if I can try and address them bit by bit. In terms of the external installation, obviously it's very difficult for me to comment on a case that I really don't have that much information on. If you want to send me that information, then I can certainly look at it as an individual point and come back to you on that. But that's not a problem. In terms of generally on after the impacts of Grenfell, I think there has been a much more of a rationalisation and an openness in terms of what the impact of external insulation is going to be. And there has been a tightening up on the regulations of what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And for that, we are guided by not only by British standards, but also by what is applicable within building control and the planning department. So, for instance, at this moment in time, there has been a suggestion that we move from one point of external cladding to another one, just because it's a new contractor in and they're more familiar with the system. Externally, it doesn't look any different. Aesthetically, it doesn't look any different. However, internally as a council, we are going through it like a fine-tooth comb to find out exactly what we are talking about here and to fully understand all and any implications before we go. And so we're talking to colleagues. We'll be discussing it with everybody that we possibly can before we come to a point in time as to say, yes, we believe that this is right and we can move forward on this. So as I say, it's something which actually is in process. And also, to be fair to our management contractor and the contractor itself, they are also going through the same process. So there'll be due diligence on everything before we go forward. As I say, if there are individual cases and you wish me to have a look at them, I can certainly have a look at them with the team, and we can also liaise with building control and planning and housing within the council to come back to you on that. So please feel free to send that through. There are, there's again, to go back to the point of the 390 homes in terms of first-time central heating. You're correct. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. We would love to be able to do more installations. But as I said at the beginning, at the moment, we've got a problem in that we're not having enough installations. And that could be for a number of different reasons. And it's our point is we have to go and find out what's causing this. Is it because of COVID? Is it because we're not marketing properly? Is it because people don't understand the system? We don't know that at the moment. So what we're trying to do is what's worked previously and trying to get numbers to sign up. And this is where I would make an appeal that we need your help and assistance. Because maybe our job is that we need to help you more to fully understand the system so that it can then be, you can be advocates in your communities to get people to sign up. And by that, then we can get increased numbers. And by that, we can then again present evidence to the Scottish Government to say, look, we need more money. This is the demand. But at this point in time, we don't have that. And this is what's causing us a bit of angst because we, as I say, it is a bit of a chicken and egg situation. We can't go for more money because we don't have sign-ups, and we don't have sign-ups at the moment. So we're really trying to work that through. And one of the things that Keith and I have discussed is that trying to reach out to your communities and yourselves, and by coming to speak to you, COVID permitting, to try to actually talk to people on the ground. Because one of the other things and issues is maybe we're not got the right interventions. And at this point in time, we don't have that evidence. So we need to speak to people in your communities to find out what the prevailing problems are, that we can then present a case to the Scottish Government. But that's medium and long term, to be honest. That's going to take a bit of time. And I would be foolish to sit and promise things that we're unable to deliver. But it's certainly something we've talked about, is that how can we increase the scope? How can we take and make a case for the disadvantages that the Highlands present and have? And how can we document that to make a stronger case? And I think that goes across all of the board and all of the interventions. And us as a team, we have to start to try and document and present that. So I think that's, to be honest, is a general bit. In terms of the conservation areas, it's a really difficult one. It's a very tricky one because the PAS legislation has a completely different section on that and what can and cannot be done in conservation areas. And so we have to be very, very careful and work with building control and work with planning to make sure that anything that's going to be in there is not to the detriment of the appearance of the conservation area. But at the same time, we have to work towards net zero, and we have to look at what can we do to make things better. And we have a number of special projects in terms of Swedish Timber. We're looking at that. We're looking also at solar PV. We're looking at batteries, and we're looking at local heating systems. We can make a case for these, but to be fair, I would rather clear our desk a little bit of where we are supposed to be in terms of progress, so that we can continue to make a case and continue to get increased funding. And just as a general comment, from what I can gather in the time that I've been in post, it would appear that Highland Council, you have successfully lobbied before and have quite a high budget rate compared to maybe other councils. I'm not saying that that's acceptable, and not in any way, shape or form, but what it shows is that the lobbying has worked previously, and so we can lobby again to try and get increased funding across it. But my responsibility and my team is we have to deliver. And if we can't deliver, then our argument tends to go against us. So I would make an appeal for everybody to, if you can, be advocates for our system.
Thank you, Stuart. And I think a wee bit of education about how much benefit that the consumer will have from having these things done. If they could understand that a bit better, perhaps with more take up. Now I have 3 more speakers, and after that we're going to move on. So I'll have Councillor Davidson, Councillor Rickson, and then Councillor McLean, and then we'll come back to Stuart for responses to that. Councillor Davidson, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks, Trish. I'd like to pick up on some of the debate that my colleagues started, which I think are really important as we go forward. And the officers, there was, first of all, there was the issue around training. And yes, by all means, get our own officers trained and who we're dealing with on a daily basis. But the big issue is training, getting a workforce pipeline that's going to be able to deliver on insulation programs. These are going to be with us for years. This is a vast undertaking. I'll come back to that. But we need to be speaking with the colleges. We need to be speaking with Skills Development Scotland, and we need to be getting a robust pipeline of youngsters trained up and into this work. I'd like to be convinced that's happening. I'm not sure it is, because I'm not hearing it. But tell me I've been asleep and that it's happening. Insulating, going back, well, insulating our houses is not a cheap option. It used to be when we thought all we had to do was roll something out in the loft. It isn't, and we have some very poor constructed houses in the Highlands, particularly in the private sector, and some of our own. So as we go forward, we've actually got to face up to the fact that this isn't 3,000 houses. This is a lot more than that. This is massive. And I'm not even sure we're concentrating on the areas of most fuel poverty at the moment. So we have to put our head around the fact that this is what it's going to cost to get the homes in Highland up to a decent standard. It will take years, but we need to be saying, what do we have to contribute to that? What does the government have to contribute? And we've got a green MSP just on the brink of going into coalition. Work them. Let's work them and say, right, what are you asking for about continued cash for insulation? This is a big deal. It would be good if the UK government invested in this and it trickled into Scotland. But we've got to ask about what are we doing? What is the Scottish government doing? But first of all, can we get our head around the scale of what we're needing to do here over the next 5-10 years, because it is massive, and it will be the best thing we can do, not for people's comfort, for people's health and longevity. They need decent, warm homes. One of the biggest killers we have is heart disease, greatly affected by cold homes. So we need to really be concentrating on where this is coming from. So I'd like to know what we're doing already with, you can't give me all these answers today, and I'm quite happy to take them afterwards. But I'd like to know what we're doing in the colleges and with Skills Development Scotland, and I'd like to know the size of the whole problem so that we can actually face up to it. If you want me to write to anyone and put the leader's name on it and the council's name, just ask. Not a problem. That can be done. Right. Okay, then I wanted to talk about why you're not getting the take-up. Because of the stunning bureaucracy around this. People get hacked off making the applications and then finding there's an exception. Oh, I can't have an old wooden house. I can't have a Doran house. I can't have this. I can't have that. Or you can't have it if you live with a business and all the rest of it. It's absolutely. It just takes the goodwill out of people and the willingness to do things. So the only way you're going to find this out is saying, how was it for you? And do it with the ones who succeeded and just see whether they've had to overcome an obstacle course. They often have. And do it with the ones that applied and couldn't get anything. Ask them what it was. And that will soon tell you. And don't make it middle and long distance. You need to know what's happening now. So somebody needs to prioritise doing a lot of phone calls for a week and trying to find out what's happening. So if you want us to publicise it, and I'm sure we're all very happy to do that, give us some a couple of paragraphs that we can get up on Facebook with a link, and we'll pass it around all of our villages and communities and all the Facebook pages that they're all using just now, and any other newsletters that are on the go. We're always willing to do that. Don't just say it, give us a hand to do it, because it's no use us putting out half the information and not the full information. So I think this is one of the biggest jobs we have to do to reduce our carbon footprint. And I don't think we've got our head yet around the scale of this. Once we've got our head around the scale of it, we'll maybe be starting to understand what needs to be done.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Stuart, for your presentation. Some of what I was going to say has been said by others previously, but can I just take us back to paragraph 5.4 when you're talking about the challenges in respect of delivery? And one of the issues is obtaining sufficient sign-ups, and that there's sometimes now a requirement for people to make a contribution themselves, and that for some, the economic effects of COVID have been quite substantial. And it does strike me that this is a major disincentive. At the end of the day, some of the people you're trying to reach have not necessarily, they maybe have assets, but they don't necessarily have cash. So for you to say to them, look, we're going to give you 18,000 towards a £20,000, heating job, but you're going to have to find the other 2,000. They just don't have that 2,000. So I think one of the issues here is seeing if we can drag in any other forms of funding. But I really do endorse what you were saying about taking the evidence back to the Scottish Government. I think the Scottish Government will understand the problems in the Highlands are quite different to those elsewhere. They have shown that other understanding in other contexts, such as housing and infrastructure and so on. So I think I'm completely with you that getting the evidence is essential. And the only other thing I would add is to add to what Margaret's just said, which is that if you can give us a way in which we can go to local people to tell them about this, I think that's handy, because I do know people who give energy advice to the local community, and it'd be really handy to take them something and say, right, this is up to you now, you get on, find out the evidence, hand it back to Stuart, and we can take it from there. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you, Dennis. And Councillor McLean, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I mean, I think one of the good things is that Highland Council now has a corporate landlord model, and through that, in my own ward, they have been looking at houses that aren't suitable, and it would cost far too much money to make the changes and improve them. So at this very moment, they're knocking down the last of a section of houses in Meiklefield Road, right behind the council offices in Dingwall. And the new properties that will be built will be, up to the new modern standards. But even doing that took an awful lot of dialogue, an awful lot of reassurance of residents in the other properties, and takes an awful lot of time. So although I agree with what Craig has been saying in some of his comments that he's written in the chat box, we can't do this overnight. And the quicker, as the Chair said at the start, we can do this, the better. Funding in rural areas, absolutely agree. We need to have an increase in the funding for us. And we've said that right from the start when John McCardick or Alan Maguire's come forward for houses in rural areas. We need to have that extra funding. And Margaret's comments about our green MSPs and the new coalition, if it goes ahead, is a vital point to look at. One of the developments in our own area in Dingwall, the original application suggested gas, and now it's air source heat pumps, which are much more expensive. And we as local members are in favour of that, but some of the residents round about were wanting to connect to the gas supply, so they are not in favour of it. So I absolutely agree with the communication. It's getting that communication out there, explaining of why we're not doing that. And even one of my colleagues was his integrity was called into question as a result of this change in the heating system. And all he was wanting to do was explain why this new air source heating systems were being put in place. I wondered, Margaret touched on it, and I'd written down, a lot of the developers that are building these properties use subcontractors as well. And I wondered about a lot of these small businesses, because of COVID, have been badly hit. And I wondered what training was provided for them and their employees as well. And was there any grants or bursaries that they could use? Because they don't have that money to do that, and for their staff to learn that expertise. My last question was, the Highland Poverty Action Group is well established in our area, and there are a lot of partners that come along talking about heating and others. And I wondered, when we communicate, we can't do that in isolation and just talk to ourselves. We need to be speaking to our community planning partners and groups like the Highland Poverty Action Group, CABs. You know, as Margaret mentioned, part of the problem is the complication of filling out applications, and a lot of people will just put it off and say, oh, you know, I've got plenty of time, somebody else can deal with it. Perhaps we need to be, changing that and help provide that information either through CABs or other organisations that are out there, and communicate with all our partners. Because as Dennis said, a lot of people, even when I've had experience of the CAB, are asset rich but actually money poor, and they just they don't have that funding to spend or the expertise to fill out applications. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Back to you then, Stuart. I've got some comments on that, please.
I think you fit on a number of things which are dear to my heart, particularly the training aspect. I am a huge believer in training, and for training young people, middle people, old people, everybody needs training. And the team, we've looked at this as well, and we are, to a certain extent, we're constrained by the existing contracts and that are there. But within those contracts, there is provision for training, and training has been undertaken. And with this past legislation, you know, we have, as part of the programme, there are a couple of our team who are doing, 3 members of our team who are attending university and receiving training on a wide range of items, part of which is this as well. So we hope to tap into their expertise to develop them, but also for them to then be able to offer their training in-house as well. In terms of what's happening on the ground with contractors, there have been a number of contractors who have also taken on apprentices, and we're keen that that should happen. And it's something, again, that we want to look at to make sure that this is a part of that the money should, whereas as much as possible, should be staying within the council region. It doesn't make sense for it to be going elsewhere, and we are lobbying for that. But in some instances, with competition law and what we're using, our hands are tied to a certain extent. But again, that doesn't mean that it's a closed door. We have to provide evidence, and we have to lobby. And as I say, that's something we are going to do. In terms of the applications, again, it's interesting that you're coming back to say that, and it's something we will certainly look at as a team. But again, it's a bit prescribed. There is a process that has to be followed, and it's a neutral process. So HES will do that process because they're impartial. We have to be very careful that we keep their impartiality, and that we're not seen to be brokers within that, because then we will lose trust. So it's very difficult. The HES, they have a set of applications. They have a number of processes that people have to go through. It's a gated process. Unfortunately, I attended a meeting with the Scottish Government last week where they want to even increase that process, and we're kicking back on that, and we're kicking back strongly on that. But again, to some extent, and maybe out of our hands, all we can do is lobby and try and get more accessibility. I would be very interested, when I come round to meet you all, hopefully, which I will do, is to get your input onto this, to actually point out and maybe speak to people to get this evidence to say, you know, that this is proven difficult, or we're unable to do this. In terms of the equity, again, I was at a Scottish Government webinar yesterday, which there is going to be a rollout of a new equity fund that would try, and the theory is that it would take and help people who are asset rich and cash poor. So they're moving forward on that, and again, we've got a number of questions, and we're putting back into that so that they can then present evidence to then develop that going forward. So it has been piloted in a number of districts, a number of councils. We weren't one of them, but they're now gathering that evidence to see how they will then roll that out. The paragraphs for Facebook, yeah, we would be more than happy. We will work with the team in the next couple of days to try and get something. and we'll try and get that out to you ASAP in terms of that. The Highland Poverty Action Groups and other groups, again, one of the things we'd like to do is come and see you, COVID permitting, in your wards, and to go to forums and to meet with different organisations that you interact with to try and get that message across, and to, as I said before, to try and gather the evidence as to what is needed and how we can then lobby that to be more effective. I know that your time is limited, but I would ask that if you have specific questions, if that's okay with the chair, that you can contact me at my email address, and I will endeavour to go through the points that you've raised and come back to you on it. Because I think it's really important that we have this open dialogue and engagement. And I understand that there are things that have gone maybe wrong or things that you're not happy about. And I think it's important that we have an open dialogue and we can come back and maybe try and address some of the problems that you've experienced in the past.
Thank you, Stuart. That's very welcome, because I'm sure there'll be different things that will come up against as this goes on. And thanks, members, for all your questions and comments on that. And we can note the report and our duty to make sure people hear about this scheme. Can we do that, members? Thank you. Okay, now we move on to item 4, an update on the Flow Country World Heritage Site bid. And I think we've got Dr. Stephen Andrews here who may want to speak to this before we discuss it. Stephen?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, a bit of a change here from kind of the built environment to the natural environment. So the purpose of the paper that we've put together for you is really to give a bit of background and an update on the World Heritage Site nomination process. So this is, I mean, just to put it in a global background in terms of its importance as a carbon sink and store. I mean, peatlands are hugely important, and their profile has been on the rise for some time. I mean, just a simple fact that they only cover 3% of the lands of the world's land surface, and yet hold 30% of the carbon that exists on land, I think puts that into context. So that is kind of one of the main drivers that brought this project forward, which has been led initially by the Peatland Partnership, but from which the Flow Country World Heritage Project Steering Group is growing out of, which Highland Council are our lead partner. And so from that, they've then employed a project coordinator, which is myself. And so I've been working on moving this project forward. So in terms of the wider background, what is it that we need to do to gain a World Heritage designation? Well, there's two main kind of documents we need to put together. The first of those is a nomination dossier, and that includes a detailed description, maps, and so on, a justification of why the site is so important. And this is on the basis of criteria defined by UNESCO. And the ones we are nominating on are on 9 and 10, which obviously means very little. But 9 is ongoing ecological and biological processes, which is the blanket bog and the sequestration and carbon store it provides. And then 10 is the natural habitats in terms of its biological diversity. So we're talking about the plants and the bird life largely. There's also then a large element of the dossier which concerns protection and how we plan to protect the area. And then the second part is the management plan. So there's some repetition within this in terms of going over what the dossier lays out. But what it really deals with beyond that is looking at the threats to the area and how we plan to manage them, and then thinking about visitors to the area as well and how they're going to be managed through the site. And so in terms of the timescale for this, we're looking at submission by the end of 2022, which seems a long time away now, but it will actually creep up. And then there's a significant period before the decision's made, which will be given to us by mid 2024. So in terms of how this is progressing, I've given you kind of the framework, I suppose, of what we're working on. There are a number of key tasks, and the highest among those is defining the boundary. So obviously we need to do that, we need to define a rationale, and that has been agreed upon around largely focusing on these features of outstanding universal value, and therefore, drawing a boundary around those. There's then the dossier contributions and defining how we're going to source those. So we've identified a number of experts, often from Nature Scott, but also from a number of other organisations, and they've been contacted and are starting to work on those, and we're starting to gain those contributions are coming in now. Then the management plan, that's been moving forward. We had put together an outline management plan, and we're now actually looking at how we can be consistent with other management plans that are out there in the area, like the Peatlands of Caithness and Sutherland management plan, and so on. So it's a case of drawing those in and seeing how we can make sure they're consistent. And there's a number of other areas around the management of the site that we've had to deal with in terms of gaining agreement on our approach to a number of issues or threats to the peatlands. For instance, the interaction of wind turbines around the site, how forestry is going to work in and around the site. And all of these things we're looking to complete by the end of this year, because the main thing we need to then go on to do is the consultation, which we've scheduled for the majority of 2022, to make sure that all of these issues are widely put out there to the public, so as they can have their comments on this. So thank you for your time, and if you've got any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you very much for that, Stephen. But I wouldn't be too comfortable. I think 2022 is not that long away, actually, so you may have your work cut out. That's a big undertaking you have here. Councillor Loudon, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Dr. Andrews, for your report. I think I think everybody's fairly supportive of this bid, and they're all keen to get behind it and hope it works. But I think one of the things I've been tracking the bit of competition from my phone. Apologies for that. Timing was perfect. I think one of the things that I think is worth noting, I've been tracking the local authority carbon emissions. It's an annual report that comes out of BASE, Business and Environment, the UK government department, and in the last year, our emissions appear to have gone up by 50%. And the reason for this, when I went back to them and said, well, what happened? That can't be right. Was a fire. Last summer, the fires in the sort of north coast gave off carbon dioxide emissions that were a significant proportion of the country's whole carbon emissions for that year. So that clearly there's a job of protection to be done, and the significance of that I don't think has really been understood by people. And it may be that whereas it was okay to have a go at Muirburn in the past, it might be that we simply can't do that in the future if everything is tinder dry, and once you start a fire, it rapidly goes out of control, and there's no way of bringing it back under control. So I think that's significant, and I think too much about these things. It's a bit of a habit of mine. So what I wondered was, is there a tipping point in terms of temperature? I know that if we looked at sort of tundra in Siberia and places like that, over the last year we've seen extraordinary changes in temperature. From maybe -20 to +30. I think in areas of Finland and as well as sort of the northern part of Siberia. Will this potentially have an effect on us? Because whereas our peat bogs at present will act as a store of carbon, by how much does the world have to warm before that process starts to reverse and they give off carbon? Because I think there may be some evidence from recent events in Siberia and Finland which would suggest that they may release methane rather than store carbon beyond a certain temperature. That's a bit too technical, maybe, for a general audience, but I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts were. Thanks.
Thank you, Derek. Councillor Davidson.
I think
You're on mute, Margaret.
Yes, thank you, Derek. Your wider reading is interesting for us all and starts the cogs working. And thank you, Andrew. Good to see you. Good to see you in post and moving things forward. One thing I was going to ask you before I come back to something else is that what stands between us and World Heritage status? What hoops have we got to go through? How long will it take? Even if we're, even if we don't get through the last hoop, how long will it take? Because I'm just interested in timescales here and what we can do. Joe Perry, when he did the initial work, the community consultation went really well. So let's build on that. And let's get huge interest in this, because yes, it's a flow country we're promoting, but what happens in the flow country can happen in other glens, the length and breadth of the Highlands, and it gives real incentives to landowners to think about what they're doing. So really interested in what you can do there. And well, I do a lot of general reading. Well, no, I don't do anywhere near enough general reading, but I do some. And I've been prioritising climate change recently. I think it's already too hot, Derek. I think peat bogs are shrinking, and we need to think about how we deal with that. Nature Scott has had a lot of input recently into, they sort of woke up with a start, and there's been a lot more input into peat and peat movements on applications. I'm not sure it's still enough. And I'm wondering whether we should be looking at our planning conditions and looking at whether away from just the wind farm sites, that we're actually looking for obligations to do some more carbon restoration elsewhere in these huge land ownings where the wind farms usually are. So just welcome your input on that. What can we do now?
Over to you then, Stephen. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, quite a bit to go through there. Yeah, first of all, thank you for your question, Councillor Loudon. Yeah, that big fire up on the north coast was certainly significant, and there have already been workshops in place. I believe there was one which had a snappy title, Fire Blanket, which was very, very useful. And that is to kind of look and see how they can be tackled in the future. The key thing from our perspective as a potential World Heritage site is that it's about keeping the bog in the best condition it can be. So I can't imagine you guys have the time like I do to go on Google Earth, but if you do and you pan around the flow country, you'll see that there's a huge number of drainage ditches. Now, some of these are very old drainage ditches, and it was part of a grant scheme to try and improve the land for grazing and so on. But very simple things like blocking these ditches, making sure that the water table is kept high is really, really important. And all of that work is ongoing alongside restoration, which was, we'll touch on what Councillor Davidson said. In terms of it, I mean, climate change is fickle, isn't it, in terms of what it's going to do to different areas. And the current predictions are that in the north of Scotland, what we'll see is a greater seasonality. So it's not necessarily going to be that we get a lot more or a big change in the annual rainfall, but what we might see is a change in how that's spread over the year, and that's very bad for peat bogs, because what you want is a consistent level of rain. In fact, it's over, I think it's 60 millimeters minimum per month through the year. So then the case then is, right, well, how can we make sure that we make the peatlands as resilient as possible? And there's lots of work going into thinking of how to do that. And it's a case of, once I suppose we can gain this this designation, that maybe gives us greater leverage to ensure that continues. In terms of a tipping point, and this is where maybe we're getting too technical and people will want to tune out, but peatland as we have is not tundra. So tundra, this tipping point comes around the fact that tundra has permafrost, and the permafrost maintains methane in a frozen state, and therefore when it heats up, the methane is released, and methane is much worse than carbon. It's about 40 times worse than carbon, or carbon dioxide. So that's a really important element. But our peatland, it's not about warming up and releasing that. It's just that it becomes more vulnerable if we warm it up and dry it out. So it's really important to keep it as moist as possible. And then there's lots of work going on to, in fact, research as well, looking at, well, what part, because where you see exposed peat, if you've been out and about and you see these, what I term hags, that exposed peat is letting off carbon. However, we don't currently understand how much of those bare peat areas are natural within the setting and how much are unnatural, and we need to work on to mitigate against. So there's research going on within the area looking at that, which will help target restoration to make sure that we try and fix what's broken, not try and fix what's natural, I suppose, is the best way of putting it. So I think that hopefully has dealt with most of your questions, Councillor Loud, and moving on to Councillor Davidson. Hoops to go through. Yes, there are many and varied. The main things that there's a whole series of pre-submission checks, I suppose, and they're the things that we'll be working towards the end of 2022. And then once we then have submitted at the end of 2022, the assessment will be done through a visit from UNESCO. So they will come out and look at the site, and we'll take them to hopefully show them some of the best bits, some of the bits that we need to work on. And then they go and they take it to their meeting, which is an incredibly long meeting, and eventually they decide, as I say, by mid 2024. So it's about a year and a half between submission and the decision being made. So it's a huge amount of time. In terms of the consultation, I think I obviously work now with Joe to some degree, and so we're looking to build on what he's done. Obviously, we're in a very different situation now with COVID still in mind. How comfortable people are going to be with face-to-face meetings is, well, that's something we need to maybe test the water with. But I think what we have seen, which is a huge benefit, is as we're all sitting here in teams, the kind of the greater comfort that people see with online meetings and online systems for gaining that feedback. And so we've got a number of useful avenues to go down in that direction. And then there was a kind of final point I think you brought up in terms of restoration, and this is kind of a little bit, I mean, it goes a bit beyond what we're doing within the World Heritage Site. I mean, it is going on there, but it's elements that Nature Scott are leading on in terms of where the restoration is going to take place, particularly around forestry. However, I do know that there have been changes in the regulations that Highland Council planners have been kind of keeping a monitor on to make sure that those applications are able to go through as smoothly as possible. But I would have to go and talk to the relevant people there to really get the detail on that, because it's a bit beyond the scope of where I'm working on just now. Hopefully those answer your questions, but I'm more than happy to take any follow-ups.
Thank you, Stephen. Councillor McInnes, please.
Thank you, Trish, and thanks for the report. It's really interesting. We had a discussion yesterday as well on which focused in on peat, and I think it might have been Business Husband who mentioned about North Uist, which is an island I'm from. So North Uist is a bog, basically. The island is a bog, and the sea impacts on that freshwater environment that the bog sits on as well. But yeah, and we've burnt a lot of peat over the years, but we don't burn as much as we did. And I think through Nature Scotland, they've been involved in how these bogs, peat bogs, have been protected over the years. And the other one, in respect of my colleague Councillor Loudon, that was an amazing figure that I never took into perspective before, about the emissions being 50%, because we did wonder what the fires contributed to CO2 emissions, because we had 6 in my location over here on the northwest coast last year. One particularly bad one between Kitchener and Lochcarron, where I live, where there were several houses that had it not been for the fire service and the locals fighting the fires, these houses would have gone. There's no doubt about it. But there's certainly one thing that I've picked up on in respect to the fires this year. We've not had as many. Don't want to tempt fate here. And the contributing factor for that has been a ranger service. If you actually look at the stats and the number of fires that they've actually come across and helped to extinguish, whether it be people with open fires, camping, barbecues, etc. And obviously that's along the North Coast 500. It's a phenomenal number that they've been involved in. I would imagine stopping quite a number of fires that would have been a lot worse and would have impacted on our land and peat bogs. So I think for the future, I think the Ranger Service is a massive important part of helping to in respect to managing future fires. Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. Do you have any comments, Stephen, on that?
Yeah, I would just like to say that's really good news, isn't it, from the point of view of the Rangers, and it's something that, going forward, once the World Heritage Site is inscribed, it's something that obviously, those Rangers currently are kind of focused around the kind of coastal areas, I suppose, where a lot of the traffic is going, and I suppose one of the benefits of having a World Heritage Site is that it will hopefully distribute some of those visitors more evenly across the Highlands, and therefore lead to less honeypotting. And with that, though, seeing those rangers working within the World Heritage Site, or some equivalent of, would be something which certainly we would see from a World Heritage Site point of view is really positive. So it's nice to hear that they're having a positive impact already, and the support for that in the future.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you for that report, Stephen. And it'll be really interesting to how your visitor management stuff comes up, because our experience, we're needing some hints and tips on that too, from what we've had the last year. Yeah.
Trish, may I just come quickly back in? I'd like to report on a conversation I had yesterday with some of my colleagues and what I've been picking up in my own ward here around Loch Ness. The number of firefighters, they're really struggling with recruitment. They've still got the rules about four firefighters have to be on a tender. The runs have not been going out in places like Tongue, Betty Hill, and around the northwest coast. I'm actually needing to meet with the senior fireman, and we did some work a few years ago about recruitment and about delivering training locally, because most self-employed people, which is what most of our retained fire crews are, don't want 2 weeks in Cambuslang and God knows what else they've got to do. They actually need local delivery of fines. So what I would ask is, my colleagues who are all here, if you've got problems with your fire service, ask the guys. They'll tell you quickly enough. How's recruitment? How's the numbers? Are they getting out? Because the last thing we need is fire crews not being able to get out. Also, the fire crews were very good at training estates, and I think there's something we need to do particularly around our precious peat bogs like the Flow Country, about making sure that the estates are getting out there and coping with the wildfires. And yes, I've had reports about the rangers stopping a lot of the campfires and the nonsense. And the quicker we ban the use of mobile barbecues, the better. Dreadful things. Okay, thank you, Trish.
I think it might be instant ones you're referring to there, Margaret, but yeah, yes, indeed. Well, we look forward to hearing of progress, Stephen, because this is an interesting project and it's really good for climate change to get these peat bogs back in order, and would hopefully be the actual restoration of the peat bogs will be done a lot more. And just as a point of note, Margaret, there are no fire services in my ward. So that's fine. Thank you, Stephen. And we'll move on to item 5, Smart Cities, Smart Buildings Programme Update. And Douglas Burns has got the update on this, please. Douglas, if we could hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Robertson. The Smart Cities project was developed through the identification of buildings within the estate that had a lack of oversight regarding day-to-day operation. In many cases, we have vast amounts of data for the estate, all of which is on different platforms. This project aims to improve on that data and, importantly, collect it all into a single online platform. The ultimate goal of the project is reducing wasted energy in our buildings, and specifically legacy buildings, where we need to innovate in order to reach our net zero ambitions. The project has 2 elements to it, the Smart Online Dashboard and the deployment of Internet of Things sensors, which I will now refer to as IoT sensors. The Smart Dashboard's primary aim is to bring all our building data streams onto one easy to access and easy to use online platform. The data we're looking to utilise includes billing data from a number of our suppliers, consumption and generation data, building management system data, and IoT sensor data. Dashboard will incorporate the use of automatic KPI cards to highlight buildings that may, for example, be heating out with the operational hours, temperatures being above the agreed council set points, or lights being left on overnight. This can then be actioned in a variety of ways, such as FM staff investigating on site, the instruction for behavioural change within a building, or further investigation on site by the climate change and energy team. The second element of the project is installing IoT sensors into buildings that currently have no or very limited remote control and monitoring. These sensors allow us to monitor temperature, humidity, light levels, room occupation, and CO2. The sensors are easy and quick to install with no intrusive works required. They are a cost-effective way of bringing building monitoring to more remote or smaller sites that do not warrant a full control system installation. It's important to note, however, that these sensors do not offer any form of control. They simply provide monitoring data that can be utilised by the Smart Dashboard, which in turn can be used to instruct behavioural change on site or provide data which can assist with business cases for building improvement works with the ultimate goal of reaching net zero across the legacy estate. The project is progressing well. The deployment of phase 1 of the IoT sensors is almost complete, with all the installs to school buildings being completed throughout the summer holidays. There are a number of additional hub office buildings that we are looking to target in line with the wider return to work by the council, which will be scheduled in for the next 2 months. In terms of the Smart Online Dashboard, this is being developed by an external specialist. We are in the final draft stage at the moment with the fundamentals of the dashboard complete. It has been challenging gaining access to all the data streams and billing information that are needed to have a complete system. However, we are at a stage where we have almost all the data streams automatically being fed into the dashboard, with only the building management system left to bring online. Going forward, we aim to develop ways of utilising the dashboard and working with our external provider to incorporate specific automated KPIs with a focus on net zero objectives and wasted energy. The mechanisms of how this will work within the council will be developed to ensure that action is taken when there are savings to be made. Phase 2 of the IoT sensor deployment will commence over the autumn and winter months. This is going to include 2 new sensor types, the first being window sensors, which will allow us to monitor when windows are opened in conjunction with heating being on, which in most cases is quite literally throwing carbon savings out the window. The second sensor type we are deploying is an Iot Compatible Sub Meter. The aim is to install these meters in buildings where there are largely all-electric heating systems with minimal controls, such as Dingwall County offices and Dornoch Academy. The meters will be installed to gain a better understanding of how and when these systems are used, but will also be installed to get more detail on lighting consumption and various other electric systems. I think at this stage I've provided a brief overview of the project and the current progress and ambitions going forward, and I would like to welcome any questions from members and thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much for that, Douglas. That's very interesting. I do hope that this will also highlight where the insulation is needed, windows are needed, and where heat is just going directly out of the building. That is probably more difficult to quantify, but I do hope it will give us an indication on that. So, Councillor Loudon first, please, and then Councillor Fraser.
Douglas, thanks very much indeed for that report. I think it's been a concern of mine for a number of years that it's actually quite difficult to monitor energy usage in individual buildings, and you know, I think it has. It's got to be a great thing if the work that you're doing will enable us to see which of our buildings are leaking energy, which are costing far more to heat than they should, and if we're going to rationalise our estate, the first thing you should be looking at is, you know, to try and see if the really expensive buildings are ones that we can either refurbish or remove and move on. I think one of the, you know, that there are a number of different ways that these buildings are heated. Some of them are all electric, some of them are gas, some of them are oil. I don't think any of them are coal, but I could be wrong. There might be one left there somewhere remote. But I think how buildings are heated, I think, is quite significant. You know, I've talked often about solar, both in terms of PV and in terms of thermal, maybe with battery storage. I know in the past that, you know, we were using biomass, so that could be pellet boilers and things like that. I noticed when I was monitoring the cost of these last year that the cost of pellets had increased significantly over the previous year, and I know that in the current year the cost of gas has gone up significantly. And although we don't have gas-fired combined cycle gas turbines producing our electricity in the Highlands, our price for electricity will go up nonetheless, just as if we were being powered by gas. So, you know, I'm expecting our costs of energy to be a significant difficulty for the council over the next year. So, more power to your elbow. The more of these sensors you can get in, the more sub meters you can get in, the better idea we'll have of where we stand, and that'll be better for all of us. So thanks very much for the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Derek. And Councillor Fraser, then Councillor Rick. Councillor Fraser, please.
I fully echo what Councillor Loudon has said there. This is a really useful piece of work, Douglas. I would, from my comments at housing and property and through this committee, you'll probably guess what I'm going to say next, is we have commercial council listed buildings that got a necklace on there, that will definitely benefit from this monitoring, and it will show exactly the problems that we have in bringing the commercial listed building estate to standard. That will have quite a high cost applied to that, and then that will then mean we will have to, as a council, have a further discussion on how we actually bring these. Some of these buildings are quite significant. I can think of, to my own area, but I can bring that to you at a later date. So these monitoring is extremely useful, and I think we should have been doing it years ago, but obviously the technology may not have enabled us to do that. But it will give us benchmarking that we can set our buildings against and see where there is slippage. So I fully welcome this, Douglas. It's a good piece of work.
Thank you. Councillor Rickson, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Douglas. I have to admit, as an ex-employee of Highland Council, as a teacher for nearly 34 years, I'm probably your worst nightmare, because as a teacher, the first thing I would ever do was throw the windows open on the grounds, cruel though it may sound, and I'm glad this isn't getting webcast to the wider world, that warm children fall asleep quicker than cold children, and that's just the beginning and end of it. And I can see a problem here, because I noticed that your quote is that when the windows are open, we're simply throwing carbon out of the window. And I noticed Councillor Loudon's comments that perhaps we should remove our more expensive buildings. And the thought of removing all our schools is perhaps a fairly radical one, but I'm reminded of what Ivan Illich used to say, which is, my education was all right until I went to school. So on that note, can I just leave you with the problem that at the moment, we've not only got an issue with COVID and having good ventilation in classrooms and windows being open, but that affects all sorts of other people too. So for instance, I was lucky enough to go to the dentist recently for the first time for about 20 months. And the first thing that I noticed is that the fans on are all the time, pumping the air around the room and out the window. So we do have a problem here, and I think we have to be honest about that. I admire your efforts. I think it's an idea with lots of potential. But from my own experience, I think one of the most simple and cost-effective methods that I ever came across in my entire teaching career was a little adhesive sticker beside every single light switch and every single heater switch in the building, simply saying, switch it off when you're not in the room, or something like that. And this was sponsored by Highland Council, because we were all Highland Council employees. And it's a long time ago, long before all this current debate about climate change and so on. But it was a cost-effective measure. It encouraged people to take responsibility for the heating and lighting in the rooms they occupied. So more power to you, but we do have a little issue here about COVID. But thanks very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Dennis, for your entertaining contribution. And I'm sure these tips from the past shouldn't be forgotten, that some of them need to be brought back for sure. It would help get things going. Councillor McLean, please, and then we'll move back to Douglas for his comments.
Thank you, Chair. And basically that was my comment. Douglas is making a good point, and we're all saying this is great, smart online dashboards. But where do people come into it all? Because you can do what you like to the building, but it's the people you have to make aware of what you have to do. Because you could be in one room and 4 people can feel hot. One could feel hot, one could feel cold. One will take a jumper or put on layers, and others will not. And so it's about educating people as well. I remember when we put in new heating system in sheltered houses in Muir Ward, and we showed the present tenants how it worked, but it was the new tenants that came in afterwards didn't know how it worked. And so they would do exactly that. They would just open the doors and the windows because they couldn't, because it was all on a timer, and they didn't know how to work the heating system. So I suppose it's about that when we have new people coming into a building or new tenants, is that ongoing education. And my next question was about COVID. Since the whole thing about COVID is improving ventilation, how do we create that balance between trying to reduce our energy wasting and also keeping people safe because of this pandemic? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor McLean. Douglas, have you got some responses, comments on these issues?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I appreciate all the comments and the kind words. We certainly do have a bit of a task in our hand. Obviously, we only have funding to do so much, and time and resource as well. So we're doing what we can at the moment. And as many of the speakers there mentioned, we have such a variety of infrastructure and equipment in our state that probably don't fully understand what works and what hasn't worked for us in the past. And if we have such a vast region, and each of these regions have different supplies. Some areas have gas, some don't have gas, some have oil, some have biomass, some have solar. And the key point of this project is to understand that. It might not necessarily to make the improvements at this point in time, but the first step in all of this is understanding what we can do and where we've maybe gone wrong and what works for us and what doesn't. Obviously, time and technology changes, and we kind of have to adapt with that. But if we can get the infrastructure in now to monitor how we're performing, then that's going to be a key sort of thing going forward for us. I think that probably covers everyone's comments there, but just to touch on some of the more specific ones, yeah, obviously touching on how we use these buildings. We're deploying sensors in schools, we're deploying sensors in offices, and all of these buildings are used in a different way. What we're finding in quite a lot of the buildings, and this will maybe help with the asset rationalization, is that there's vast spaces within these buildings that aren't used to their full potential. But the infrastructure we have to heat these buildings doesn't mean that we can shut areas of our buildings off. So we're heating huge buildings or any buildings up, meeting rooms, open spaces, and you might find there's only a handful of people in these buildings, which is a key finding, and there's probably no easy way around it. There's no easy solution. It's going to cost the council money to sort this, but it's absolutely key that we do this for the sort of net zero and carbon neutral objectives going forward. Obviously, there's a couple of points raised there on COVID, which, yeah, that's had a huge impact on this project in the last sort of 12 to 18 months. It has kind of stunted our progress a little bit. We haven't been able to get out to as many sites as we wanted to. We've probably not been able to spend the money as quickly as we would like to have done previously, and we haven't been able to actually physically go to sites due to the restrictions. With regards to the ventilation, that's a requirement from the government and from health sort of boards suggesting that we do that, and at this moment in time it's kind of unavoidable. But if that's going to have to be a long-term sort of solution, then we need to understand, again, use the data to figure out how can we work smartly with this, and is there anything we can do to reduce our ongoing costs, which again we probably don't fully understand at this moment. Yeah, I think that's probably answered everything to some degree, probably not enough, but I'm happy to sort of come back to anyone with further points.
That's great. Thank you very much, Douglas. And I'm sure you're well aware of problems, and it's just another complication, this ventilation for COVID, because this information will be useful to us as we try to do something about the state of buildings going forward. So thank you for that, and I'm sure we'll be hearing from you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
So members, we turn to the Glasgow Food and Climate Declaration, and we have Emma and Keith to support us on this, and I'm sure this will provoke quite a bit of discussion. We've got a lot to do on this. We've only just started, and from what I'm hearing in the last few days, we're actually not on the front foot on this. So is it Emma, you're going to speak to this report?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I'll hand over to you now then, Emma. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so it's great to be here and tell you a little bit. I'm just going to pick out some of the key points from the report, and I think the most exciting bit about this is going to be the discussion around it. So I'm going to keep this fairly short, but hopefully with the key bits of information. So the Glasgow Food and Drink Declaration was developed in anticipation of COP26. And as a third of our global greenhouse gas emissions come from food and agriculture, which is similar to our estimation of our national figures as well, it is imperative that we tackle the food system if we're ever going to achieve the Paris Agreement targets. So there's a common phrase that's kind of floating around just now, which I love, which is the road from Paris to Glasgow goes through the farm gate. And this, in essence, is the rationale behind the declaration. It was prepared in partnership between international networks of subnational governments, UN agencies and non-governmental agencies working with food systems. It was officially launched in December last year, and the Scottish Government showed real leadership and signed the declaration ahead of the launch, and since then both Glasgow and South Lanarkshire councils have signed. And when the Highland Council signed it in June, we were one of the first few, and it's anticipated that this autumn several other local authorities will join this call to action and pledge their commitment. So the aim of the declaration is to bring the commitment of food systems transformation to COP26 as an integrated solution to the climate emergency with co-benefits for biodiversity, ecosystems regeneration, circularity, access to sustainable and healthy diets for all, and the creation of resilient livelihoods for farm and food workers. The declaration recognises the significant role for local authorities in forging pathways to reducing the climate impacts of our food systems. And for example, these might be food waste reduction schemes, might be healthy and sustainable procurement in public canteens. It might be public campaigns to encourage behaviour change towards sustainable diets, or the provision of food growing opportunities, and another might be to support short supply chains. Our actions need to be aligned horizontally across policy areas and vertically between different levels of government. I'm sure we'll all agree that food touches many different policy areas, and a holistic food system approach facilitates the development of coherent policies at both the local and national level. So, to conclude, it is of paramount importance that we tackle the food system if we are serious about not only the climate and nature emergencies, but also our national health crisis. Each local authority has a significant role to play, and the commitment made by signing this declaration is a very encouraging next step, a very encouraging step forward. We now need to work out what we do next and what action we're going to take. In this last month, the Highland Council has recruited Kirsty Ellen as a community food growing coordinator. So it's absolutely brilliant to have someone focused on the community growing sector, which is an important jigsaw piece to this bigger issue. The Highland Good Food Partnership has also recruited a coordinator, Katrina, and both Katrina and Kirsty have joined us on this meeting. Katrina only started on Monday, but she's already in dialogue with Food for Life to develop current relationships with Highland Council in terms of procuring healthy local food to our schools. And I'm sure you'll agree that both these recruitments are a start in the right direction. So I hope this gives you a wee bit of a flavour for what the Glasgow Food and Climate Declaration is. And I really look forward to discussing and hearing what our next steps are, not just in this forum, but going forward in the short and medium term. So I'm happy to answer any questions and really excited to hear some ideas that we might have.
Thank you very much, Emma. And Food for Life you did mention, which Highland Council has had the Bronze Award in some of our schools for quite some time. I'm quite disappointed that we haven't actually managed to roll it out to others. And school meals yesterday didn't come up to the description, so I'm making some inquiries about that. So that's just one area that we need to look at. Transport to the Highlands, of course, is another huge issue. We need all our foods brought up that A9 or the A96. So we need to look at decarbonisation of transport, of course, for that. And we need to become more aware of food miles and where we can reduce them. I've asked that allotments be given more consideration, and hopefully that will help. I'm trying to get you all to think about all various areas that you can ask questions about, get discussion going here. It staggers at the first hurdle because getting them set up is really quite difficult. So we need to get a wee bit more of encouragement in there and help communities to do that. And hopefully we've got the resource in place now to get that done. So just with that few comments of areas that we have got lots of work to do, I'll pass over to Dennis Rickson, who's got the first comment question on this.
Thanks, Trish, and thank you for your prompts, because it did actually prompt me with one. Emma, apparently somebody did a calculation, and apparently agricultural output in the harbour has declined by over 90% in the last century. I don't know whether that's replicated all the way across the Highlands, but of course that's part of the issue, that if small farms don't work in parts of our Highland areas and we bring the food in from outside, that has a huge impact on the sort of things you're discussing. That wasn't actually what I was going to bring up, but the chair prompted me on that one and I thought I couldn't let it pass. The issue that I was going to bring up, and I don't expect an answer from you, but I wonder if I could just lodge it as being something that I think is worth looking at, is the issue of food waste from supermarkets. Now, the reason that I'm aware of it is because we have food larders in some of our communities during COVID. They sprung up all over the place. To be quite honest, I think they've been wonderful. I take my hat off to all the community groups that have been doing them and so on. But I am aware that what's been happening in some places, they're getting almost industrial quantities of food from supermarkets, which are just coming up to expiry date. Now, in a way, this is a good system. If people have been struggling during COVID and we can supply them with food before it expires, it's great. But of course, the point that's being made to me is that this really doesn't tackle the problem. If we're getting large amounts of food that are going to waste from supermarkets, that's not a good solution to a problem. So I think if we could involve supermarkets in our discussions at some stage, I think it'd be really useful, because it's difficult for us as lay people to get a handle on how big the problem is. It's only when I hear about it in the context of food banks that I see that there are actually very large quantities of food at issue here. Thanks very much, Chair. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you. And on that note, as you were speaking, Dennis, the combine has just appeared at my window, cutting the barley just right outside the hedge. So apologies if there's a bit of noise there at the moment. Councillor Loudon, please.
Thanks again, Chair, and thanks, Emma, for the report and for the enthusiasm. I think that's always important to see that the officers are keen to make progress with these ideas. The first thing I think is maybe just a comment on supermarkets. Supermarkets will take crops that are grown here and cart them off to the other end of the country. And then they'll take crops that were grown at the other end of the country and drag them here. Maybe, we should, if we're trying to reduce food miles, maybe there should be some way of short-circuiting this. At present, I'm assuming it's only the supermarkets that are buying in bulk, but maybe there's an opportunity for some sort of collective to buy from farms locally and keep the crops that are grown locally local. We won't eat all of them. There'll still be some that go out of the area, but we could either work directly with farms or with supermarkets to try and make sure that happens. In terms of planning, yes, it's possible to have allotments, but I have talked before about the role of planners in achieving this, and I've not always talked in a positive way. Do allotments need a deer fence erected around them? Do they need to be lit by street lights? And do they need a car park that's tarred? Personally, I don't think so. But that approach is not one that's universally adopted across the council when it comes to getting permission for an allotment. So maybe it's something that we should talk to planners about and see whether they can be persuaded to be a bit more lenient, to give community groups wanting to start allotments an opportunity to get going without burdening them with £100,000 of expenses to get their allotment established. Waste heat, especially in distilleries, there's very often a lot of spare heat, and is there any way we could talk to distilleries and see whether they were able to consider some sort of mechanism for that excess or waste heat being used to assist community groups to grow food locally. Community land. There's a lot of community land buyouts around the Highlands, so it's not always the case that there's a a problem in gaining access to land. And maybe that's an area, again, where maybe in more rural communities we could do a bit more in terms of allowing people to grow food on land that the community owns. And my last point, community woodlands. We can grow things in polytunnels, but trees also produce produce. You know, we can grow apples fairly easily in our climate, and as the climate warms, that's even more possible. We can grow plums. You know, there's lots of stuff that woodlands could be adapted or developed to provide. So I'll shut up at that point and let other people have a chance.
Thank you, Derek, but I think you might find it's the allotment association more than the planners that are putting the regulations around what that has to be required. But I have spoken to the planners, and if a developer is saying allotments, and it's not just land for allotments, and even if it is, we're going to try and encourage them to provide the infrastructure necessary to get them started. So there has been a move on that. So move to Councillor McLean now, please.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. I was just agreeing with you there, because one of my concerns was a number of years ago, even when Liz Cowie was our ward manager, we were looking at allotments, and that's when the council had a good policy on allotments. But part of the issue was getting the water supply to although the council had areas of land, it was the actual water supply was one of the barriers to that. And so the areas that we have at the moment in our ward are more community gardens than allotments to get round some of the kind of barriers that we've had. And Emma could talk about what she's produced in the Muir Ward, along with a team of people that she's supported. And that's about putting in apple trees and other fruit trees and everything else. So, you know, but Derek's comments, you know, Emma's been kind of at the forefront of that in Muir Ward. But I would say that food waste is a big issue. Councillor Trish Roberts and myself met just recently with a group or an individual who's working with a landowner in Dingwall to produce a Dingwall community wood, and that's quite exciting. So, you know, there's lots of things happening out there in our communities, and I suppose it's for us to get more information on what's going on. The other, you know, there's 3 commitments that are in the report. They're all very good, but until we can get a much more buy-in from individuals in the community, because some of these projects, whether it be allotments or to deal with food waste, I'm involved in, as Emma is too, with food projects in the ward. There's some people that are not in favour of some of the change. They don't like the change. They don't like the projects that are being brought forward. But even my own grandfather, he had an allotment, but it was because he worked on the railway workers got allotments, and that made it much easier. And I think that we should be looking not just at Highland Council, but some of the other organisations that are out there, see what land they've got available. Even Scottish Water, should they be providing free supplies when they're putting in new pipes and stuff? Should they be looking at areas and having a supply rather than charging maybe the council or communities to put in the water supply for where we want to put allotments? So I will stop. There was something else I was going to say, but I can't remember. Oh yes, regional land use partnerships. You talked about farming. I mean, one of the local farmers in my area has been, really in support of it, wanting to find out more about it. But it seems that we don't have, the Scottish Government haven't come forward with how these regional land use partnerships are going to work, because there are a lot of farmers out there that do want to help. They are very, we do a lot of work in the environment and supporting change, but we need to work with more, but we need to know exactly what the guidelines are going to be of this new regional land use partnership. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And on food waste, I mean, I know that a lot of the farmers produce an awful lot of good stuff. I mean, in my area alone, the carrots, I think they would probably feed the whole of the UK. But I see a lot of that going down to forests, getting washed and coming back as animal fodder because they're rejected by the supermarkets because of size, shape or whatever. And that's not just happening in carrots, it's happening a lot of things. So as a community,
you're right.
As consumers, we need to realise that a cauliflower doesn't need to be 4 inches. Sorry, I'm not metric on that size. It can actually be 30 centimetres across. So, you know, little things like that that we need to be aware of. But Emma, there's a lot in there for you to go. You obviously were very enthusiastic about this particular idea.
Yep, I think I just wanted to point out that I don't actually do this as a job. So when we're speaking about, there's nothing I can actually do here. It's kind of like trying to create this sense of we, like what can we do? And this idea, absolutely and utterly, is going to need resource if we're serious about it. This has been driven by passion to date, and this is probably going to be the last time that Keith's going to give me time to be focusing on this passion, because I need to really focus on Highland Adapts. As you all know, that's been my role for the last few months. So this really has to be something that I just wanted to highlight, that this is a we kind of situation. Obviously, we do have Kirsty and we do have Katrina, so to be picking up this conversation going forward. I think there's some really interesting points that you've made there, and there's some key themes that we're all talking about here. Now, food waste is an exceptionally interesting one, and it's an absolutely and utterly massive issue that we have to tackle if we're serious about this. When we actually think that if we're to look at individual carbon footprints, food is far greater than the fuel that we use for travel. It's far greater than the energy that we use for our homes. Food is up there at the top, and waste is a significant part of that. Now, a lot of the carbon footprint of food is actually 60% of the carbon footprint of food is before it leaves the farm. Right, so there's things that have to happen at a systems level. That's not necessarily what we are talking about here. Okay, but we have to think, what can we do as a local authority, and then obviously what can we do as citizens. But if we think about that food waste that's post farm, 70% of that is actually from the household. So that's choices that we are all making as consumers, and it actually costs us a fortune every single year financially as well. It's one of the most costly parts of our carbon footprint that we waste. So there's a huge scope there for education, and I think there's an opportunity, even as a minimum, from the Highland Council signing this declaration, in the sort of public communication that goes out to sort of celebrate this, is to sort of take an opportunity to remind people of simple things that we can actually all do that are better for our health, better for the planet, and better for our pocket, better for our finances. And obviously there's several of you here that are familiar with things that communities are doing with food waste programmes like this, and Muirvord obviously being one, and then Zero Waste Scotland has put in a bid. I think I've mentioned this to you before, but put in a bid to the Climate Change Lottery Fund to have a Highland-wide waste reduction programme, which would bring 10 part-time members of staff covering the whole entire area to be driving forward this whole food waste agenda, of which the Highland Good Food Partnership would end up with a member of staff to sort of coordinate that, if you like. So there's things happening out there that there are other parts of the wider community in the third sector, whatever, driving forward this agenda. But I think what is really good to come back to is to think about what we can do as a local authority. And I think, Trish, you're always really passionate about what we could be doing in terms of the schools and what we can be doing there in terms of procurement. And I think that is a huge step that we can be taking in the right direction. And I think developing the conversations with the Food for Life at the Soil Association, they're there to help us, they're there to support. Their barrier has been the local authority having the resource and the capacity to work with them. So maybe that's something that we need to be addressing and looking in a bit more detail about that. But having Katrina on board from the Highland Good Food Partnership point of view is certainly another source of energy, another voice, and another bit of resource to kind of drive forward this this agenda. I would agree with you, Trish, that I don't think it's the planners that are the obstruction to the allotments. They're actually, I would like to reassure everybody that the planners are actually really supportive and positive about community growing, and really quite keen to see this as a really positive movement. So we can feel reassured about that. The Regional Land Use Partnership, I don't know if Nicole's still on the call, but I do know that they're in their early stages of their governance process and developing their governance, and I'm sure that we'll hear more about that going forward. But the Highland Good Food Partnership, as well as Highland Adapts with another hat on, really quite keen to work very, very closely with the partnerships that evolve from that. I think that for just now, as much as I've got to say, I just really want to feel that this is the start of a conversation, and that we can really come up with some creative ways to start working together, and we can see what other people can do. That's great, but what can we do? You know, what steps can we take? And there's actually quite a lot that we can do, and I think that's where we need to focus our thoughts and our energy.
Thanks, Emma. And I don't know if you're willing to do this, Kirsty and Katrina. If you'd like to say hello to members after we've spoken, after Craig's had his say, just give you a wee bit of warning. You might want to say hello and a wee bit about what you see going forward. But don't worry if you don't want to, but I'm just giving you the opportunity if you'd like to take that. Councillor Fraser, please.
Yeah, I wasn't actually going to say anything, but listening to what Emma said and other members have said, I actually started looking about food miles a number of years ago, seeing where the produce comes from. And I was looking on the back of packets of prawn, and they come from Mexico. I was looking at other aquaculture products, and they're coming from all over the world. And yet we have a high quality aquaculture business in Scotland. And I think people need to start buying local sourced aquaculture products, be it prawn or lobster, whatever we can get from here, because it's easier to take it from Lochimver into Scotland than have our shellfish exported. Well, it used to be exported, shall we say, to various areas. You know, because if we have a ready market for our shellfish producers, we cut down their food miles, we cut down on the carbon emissions, etc. I'm not saying everything needs to be that way, but it's a conversation I think that we need to have, and that's why I wasn't sure whether it was the right thing to bring in it, because we're talking more about the farming side of things, the land farm, as opposed to the sea farm, and I'd just like to make that observation.
Thank you, Craig. Emma, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I just agree that food is absolutely naturally from the sea as well. So there's no limitations that this is about the land. This is about the sea too. The challenges are that it's not so easy to buy local, and that's things that we're working on at the Highland Good Food Partnership level. There, you know, trying to you're battling against a system that we need. That's our work's not only about what can we be doing locally, it's about lobbying nationally, it's about working internationally. How can we be changing things? That's going back to this whole integrated food systems approach that we're talking about. You know, it's about linking all these linkages horizontally through different policy realms, but it's also about the different vertically through the different levels of government, if this is actually ever going to work. So totally and utterly just agreeing with what you were saying there. It's if you think that agriculture production has reduced in the Highlands, but we're now limited to a few products, and most of that is for another market. It's not about feeding local people. There is a shift and there is a change, but it's slow. But this is what this movement is all about. Yeah, and it's only going to work if we all work together on the various different elements of it all. And I go back, I know I sound like a broken record, but I go back to the role with the Food for Life and the procurement opportunities for a local authority to start working with local producers to say, okay, we'll buy some of your fish for the schools, for your local, and it doesn't have to be the whole entire Highland Council area. It can just be one producer serving one school. It could be local bread, it could be local vegetables, it could be local fish, it could be whatever. But the point is that we can start building up that local food economy by leading by example as a local authority and starting to procure our food in a different way. So yeah, that's the sort of final thoughts there.
Thank you, Emma. Yes, you're right, and it's one school at a time, one canteen at a time, really, is how we want to do it. But it's up to us members to put the pressure on to make sure this happens. So, Kirsty, would you like to say hello?
Hi, hello. Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to say it's really exciting. I'm really glad to be joining the council at this point in time where it feels like there's an awful lot of energy and momentum building and growing towards this agenda, and a lot of awareness across the council. Everybody that I've been speaking to over the last couple of weeks since joining has really been aware of this agenda and very supportive of this piece of work that I'm going to be here to help move forward. And I think it's a good time as well with the impact over the last 18 months, with general population becoming so much more aware of our food resilience and insecurity and the benefit of locally produced food, and feeling secure as a community and being able to produce our own food, and having that kind of resilience, and also understanding the benefit of communities in producing food and supporting each other that way. What Emma just said about the different levels and how this all comes together from policy to structure and then into practice as well. It's really exciting to be in this kind of post, which will hopefully enable members of our community and the council to support really practical things to take place that will help people respond to climate change and to their own food resilience as well. Harken back to the discussions earlier on today about energy efficiency and making those, taking down those barriers and making it possible for individuals to make those changes in their day-to-day lives as well. So I'm very glad to be joining the team at this point. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, that's great, Kirsty. Thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing how you progress with this. Katrina, do you want to have a turn?
Yeah, hi. I guess I'll introduce myself. And as Emma said, I just started on Monday, so just settling in. But I kind of echo what Kirsty said. It's really exciting to join at this time, and really nice to hear some of your ideas, particularly about, redirecting produce that's grown in the Highlands to the Highlands. But obviously, there's huge barriers to that. And I'll put my email in the chat, and I'm here to help, and I would love to assist in projects and ideas that you guys have. So feel free to drop me an email, and I'll spend the week sort of finding my feet a little bit, and excited to work with you all.
That's great. Thank you, Katrina. Welcome to the team. That's
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you. It's I'll put you both on the spot there, but you've done very well. Thank you very much indeed. Councillor McLean, did you have something else to add?
I was just wanting to ask a question. I'm not sure if you would answer it. When Emma's talking about procurement and we're talking about Highland Council, I wondered, maybe Kate can answer it. Should we be looking at our community planning partners as well, and especially NHS, given all the food that they produce or buy? Is that an opportunity to look at there, jointly with us, so that we can support more local farmers or growers? Thanks.
Councillor McPherson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for allowing me an opportunity to speak. Sorry for joining you so late. I was at another meeting before this. And Emma, nice to see you again, and welcome to Kirsty in her new role. Just a point in terms of the food miles that was made so well by Craig Fraser there. We should be encouraging our schools, colleges, care homes, and then everywhere within Highland Council, to be buying locally wherever we possibly can, and to be supporting local food producers. And if we can also influence our partner agencies at NHS Highland, at HIE, and at the University of the Highlands and Islands. And last week, one of the local fish and chip shops in my ward told me that he had to open without any fish. He couldn't get any fish. And he said in the week before, the only place he could get fish was from Berlin in Germany. It's unbelievable. So in the space of a week, I was in the Kyle of Lachauche and couldn't get a haddock supper. They offered me hake or lemon sole because they said there is no haddock. We can't get haddock. We can't get supplies. And they were blaming it on Brexit. And then in West Hill and Inverness, the man said he had to open with no fish at all in his fish and chip shop. So we need to be putting these people in contact with the food growers and suppliers. And I see Alec McInnes here from Organic Sea Farms in Skye. We need to be seeing what we can do to partner up people together and be feeding from what we have within our own Highland larder. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McPherson. And I thought, yeah, Kate Lackey would like to have a word now, please. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, members. Just to pick up on the couple of points that were raised by Councillor McLean about procurement and procurement partnerships, I think is a really important approach for us. I think what we need to understand, and I think we all do, is as a council, we have to work with all our partners to make the changes that will impact on climate change. It's not something the council can do on its own. And I think procurement in partnership is something that we definitely need to be looking at. And so I will pick that up, certainly. And I'm fairly new to this, as you may be aware, and certainly in terms of procurement around about how we help to advance our climate change requirements through procurement, but it's certainly something we will be wanting to explore. I think I would also just like to reassure members the council is actually in the top quartile when it comes to locally procured goods. And it is something that we have taken a real proactive stance on. Now, that doesn't mean to say there can't be improvements made and we can't do better, because we can always do better. But I think it is important to note that the council has taken a really positive stance on local procurement, and that puts us in a very good light nationally. So I really just wanted to pick up on those 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's us come to the end of our time, but not too bad. We're only a minute over this time. Thank you all for your reasonably concise comments and questions. I'd like to see you keeping this up. And thank you all for attending today. Thank you to all the officers who prepared the reports and answered all the comments and queries. We'll see you again next time. Thank you, folks.